election. Take it from there.
Well, he describes the extensive actions by the Russians to interfere in the presidential election. It talks about the hacking of the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign, as well as the hacking of John Podesta. It also talks about the social media campaign aimed at sowing divisions among Americans along the issues of immigration, race, and other ways. So he basically makes it very clear that this was not a hoax in any regard into what the Russians did, that this was an active and very pervasive campaign they conducted.
He then goes on to say that the special counsel did not find, and this is significant, did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated the Russian government in these efforts, despite multiple offers from Russian-affiliated individuals to assist the Trump campaign. Dan Abrams, this is key.
Yeah, that's the critical question with regard to interference in the election and conspiracy with the Russians. It sounds like the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign, as you just said, conspired with, coordinated with the Russian government efforts, despite those offers from the Russians to assist. So it's basically question one is Russian interference. Question two is obstruction of justice.
More complicated conclusion there on obstruction of justice. And what he's saying here is that the special counsel did not reach a traditional judgment on whether or not the president committed obstruction of justice.
In essence, what they're saying is that the special counsel punted because there is this Office of Legal Counsel opinion that the president can't be indicted. So the special counsel did not even engage in the sort of analysis that it ordinarily would do. Now, they do summarize, though, the fact that the special counsel considered it. The special counsel did not draw a conclusion one way or the other. Instead, for each of the relevant actions investigated, the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question, leaves unresolved what the special counsel's view as to, quote, difficult issues of law and fact are. The special counsel stated that while this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. But then importantly, it goes on later in the next paragraph to say that the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, and I, meaning Attorney General Barr, have concluded that the evidence developed during the special counsel's investigation is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Our determination was made without regard to and is not based on the constitutional considerations that surround the indictment and criminal prosecution of a sitting president. So we don't want to say that the two are at odds, but it seems that the special counsel's position was it's not our position to decide this, but we'll tell you we're not implicating, we're not exonerating. Then Rod Rosenstein and Attorney General Barr together have determined that there is not enough evidence for the crime of obstruction of justice.
They're going much further. They're saying we have chosen not to prosecute this or go forward on this, not because of the Office of Legal Counsel guidance that a president can't be indicted, but based on the evidence they have.
And that's a win for the president. I mean, there's no question, particularly when you have Rosenstein in there, right? And because we've all been...
He appointed the special counsel.
Exactly, exactly. We've been talking so much about Rod Rosenstein. This is someone who's become, who's been criticized at length by many on the right, who is now saying, along with Attorney General Barr, we do not think there is enough evidence here to move forward with obstruction of justice.
Let me go to our chief White House correspondent, John Carl, there. So on the two big questions right there, Special Counsel Robert Mueller has concluded no conspiracy, no members of the Trump team conspired with the Russians despite offers, and the Attorney General has decided, along with the Deputy Attorney General, not enough evidence for obstruction of justice.
George, this will be taken at the White House and by the president's allies as a complete vindication of the president. As the president has said over and over and over again, there was no collusion, and he has said no obstruction. Now, Congress will continue to look at both of those questions, undoubtedly. There are further criminal cases involving the president and associates of the president, but in terms of what we are seeing here today, the special counsel, after 22 months of investigation, has concluded that the Russians certainly had an operation to interfere with the U.S. elections. He's proved that chapter and verse, but that there was nobody involved with the Trump campaign that had anything whatsoever to do with it. And as you said, although the special counsel did not make a determination either exonerating or finding the president guilty of obstruction, as far as Rod Rosenstein, a top vilified critic, vilified by many of the president's closest allies. He and the Attorney General have concluded that even if you were to look at a sitting president as somebody who could be indicted, there simply is not the evidence to charge him with obstruction of justice. So again, bottom line, make it very clear, something the president has called a witch hunt for the better part of these past 22 months has ultimately, in the view of this White House and the president's supporters, will now be seen as a vindication of the president.
Different view, Mary Bruce, on Capitol Hill, our senior congressional correspondent, Mary Bruce. We're already getting some reaction from the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Gerald Nadler.
And George, he is making very clear that he views this as the Justice Department essentially punting to Capitol Hill. In a tweet, Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, says that, quote, "It seems like the Department of Justice is putting matters squarely in Congress's court." He goes on to note and highlight that the Justice Department determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment. And of course, he notes that the special counsel states that the report doesn't conclude that the president committed a crime, but it also does not exonerate him. George, you are going to continue to hear, I am sure of it, those calls from Democrats here, not only for the full report, but of course all of the underlying evidence, as they now have to make a determination about what the consequences of the special counsel's investigation really are.
Yeah, and I want to go to our senior national correspondent, Chair Moran, for more on this as well. As Dan Abrams suggested, and we're hearing as we read the letter, seeing as we read the letter, there does seem to be some tension on the obstruction issue between the position of Robert Mueller and the decision and the conclusions of the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General.
Well, the way I'm reading this, and we're reading it in real time, is that essentially Mueller decided, it seems to me, that as the special counsel, he didn't have the position. He's not accountable enough to the president, to the people of the country, to make the mammoth decision about whether the president could be indicted. He punted to the Attorney General. He let the Attorney General make this decision. And then the Attorney General, with the previous acting Attorney General in this regard, Rod Rosenstein, said that even if he could indict a president, this case doesn't rise to obstruction. And here is why. In Washington, there's often the statement, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. What Barr says here is that there was no crime. He says, quoting the Mueller report, quote, "The evidence does not establish that the president was involved in an underlying crime related to Russian
that's the
interference."
Point I wanted to pick up on with Dan Abrams as well. So what he's basically saying is that because the president, there was no underlying crime, they didn't find any conspiracy by his campaign or by the president himself, that makes it much more difficult to reach the charge of obstruction.
Right, but I don't really agree with Terry that Mueller was punting to the Attorney General. I think that Mueller was punting. There's no question about it. But I think if you were to ask Mueller, were you basically saying, let's leave it in the hands of the Attorney General? My guess is he was saying, look, if impeachment is the sole remedy for a crime of a president, it's not our position. And my guess is that Mueller might take the position it's not the position of the Attorney General to make that sort of decision either. So that's unresolved as far as I'm concerned. Now, in particular, when you see the language in here, that the special counsel investigated this and that the special counsel did not draw a conclusion one way or the other as to the examined conduct, but for each of the relevant actions investigated, and the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question. That's what Congress is going to want. They're going to want to see what were the arguments that Mueller was laying out for and against. And I think Congress is going to want to make its own determination, because if the position is it's not our job as special counsel to make an indictment decision, then it's not the Attorney General's job either. Well, then it's the Congress's decision.
I wanted to pick up on that because we're going further, and I want to bring in Pierre Thomas on this as we read through the letter and deeper into the letter, Pierre. This is from the Attorney General. In cataloging the president's actions, many of which took place in public view, so they're emphasizing that, the report identifies no actions that, in our judgment, constitute obstructive conducts, had a nexus to a pending or contemplated proceedings, and were done with corrupt intent, each of which would have been necessary in our judgment.
That's right. That's the Deputy Attorney General and William Barr, the Attorney General, concluding that, look, based on the evidence that they saw, they could not conclude that the President of the United States obstructed justice. But, George, it goes back to the underlying issue that because they never could prove that anyone related to Trump or in the Trump campaign conspired with the Russians at all, that was the guiding point of their analysis on the obstruction of justice issue as well. And one of the things that's remarkable, as someone who's covered this for now 22 months, is that in each indictment, we never had a case where Mueller brought before court and accused any American, anyone associated with Trump, with directly conspiring with the Russians. And I was speaking with some sources about that, and one of the things that some sources said is that, look, we never could find that the Russians ever actually put anything in the hands of Trump campaign officials, even on the WikiLeaks issue. In terms of the whole question about people associated with the Trump campaign trying to get information with WikiLeaks, they never established that anything was actually placed in the hands of Trump campaign officials, George. And I think that was a key issue, that at the end of the day, what Mueller did in public court was a precursor to what we see in this summary of conclusions today, George.
Mary Bruce, we're now hearing from the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the president's close friend, Lindsey Graham.
Yeah, and Lindsey Graham saying in a statement just now that this is a good day for the rule of law and a great day for President Trump and his team, highlighting no collusion and no obstruction. He says, quote, the cloud hanging over President Trump has been removed by this report. He goes on to say it was a bad day for those hoping the Mueller investigation would take down President Trump. He says it now is time to move on. And George, I think that is an argument that you are likely to hear echoed by Republicans up here, that Democrats were waiting for Mueller to wrap up his report. He has done that, and they are going to say that this should be the end of it, that it is time to move on. On the flip side, Democrats are going to argue this is just the beginning, George, that they need to see the full report and the underlying evidence as they continue to ramp up their scores of their own investigations into the president and this administration.
Okay, Mary Bruce, thanks very much. I know you're going to try to get some more congressional reaction as well. Cecilia Vega at the White House, one of the president's associates, tweeting as well.
Dan Scavino, his social media director, George, and I think it's probably what we'll be hearing from the president's allies over the course of the day and weeks to come. He says, quote, fact, as we've been saying for the past 2 years. And then he goes on to quote, the special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia in its efforts to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election. That is going to be the key line from this report, that the Republicans and the president, that his allies are certainly going to be championing for a long time to come. The president, as you know, is in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. He is expected to get on Air Force One very soon, within minutes, and head back here to the White House. So we may actually get to hear from him, because he will be with the reporters who were traveling with him. He has shown uncharacteristic restraint in the last couple of days, George, not tweeting at all about this report coming out. And he's been described to us as by people who've been in touch with him over the last few days as being in a great mood. I can only imagine that this report is going to put him in an even better one.
Okay, Cecilia, Chris Christie, another ally of the president, former governor of New Jersey. Your reaction?
Well, listen, I think the money line in the report is that the special counsel didn't find the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia. Not Bill Barr, not Rod Rosenstein, but Bob Mueller, who, I've been saying from the beginning, and lots of other people who've been involved in federal prosecution in this country have been saying from the very beginning, is the gold standard in this regard, a guy who should be taken seriously. He has found, not that he's found that there was no collusion, no conspiring between the Trump campaign and the Russians. That's a huge development for the president, because that's what he's been saying all along. Many of us who were involved in the campaign have been saying we saw no evidence of that right from the beginning. And Bob Mueller's now had everything at his disposal, and the Attorney General has confirmed that he was never once stopped from doing anything he wanted to do, from pursuing any avenue he wanted to pursue. And having done that for 22 months, that's what he found. And on the obstruction issue, George, I just say one other thing, that I agree with what Terry's saying on this, that in the end, this is not Bob Mueller's call to make. Bill Barr is the Attorney General of the United States. He is making that prosecutorial judgment. It doesn't preclude Congress from doing whatever it wants to do. But I think it is much harder for Congress to continue to be ultra-aggressive on obstruction of a non-crime. And so that, I think, is going to be very difficult for Congress.
Well, it does.
And I think they're going to have to move on.
I want to follow up on that. It does appear that the Attorney General is basing his judgment on obstruction of justice in large part on the special counsel's conclusion that there was no underlying conspiracy or cooperation with the conspiracy.
That's absolutely right. And by the way, the other thing that no one has determined here, and the Attorney General has said did not exist, was a corrupt intent. That's required as well. And the fact that there is no underlying crime, and the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, and I think that's really important as well. I think we now know why Rod Rosenstein stayed and didn't leave a couple of weeks ago as he was planning to do. I think Bill Barr wanted to make sure that he had Rod Rosenstein, who appointed Bob Mueller, there to help him make this judgment. And they made it together. And there's no way that Rod Rosenstein would allow his name to be put in this letter if Rod Rosenstein didn't support the conclusion that the Attorney General is making. So this letter is a complete home run for the President of the United States. And it should end any talk of Russia. There should be no further talk of Russia. Bob Mueller has said there is no evidence that concludes that there was conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government or Russian officials to interfere with the election. That should end the discussion of it. We should stop it right here.
Mary Bruce, we're seeing the ranking Republican on the House Judiciary Committee pick up on what Chris Christie was just saying.
Yeah, Doug Collins has just put out a statement saying that he hopes that Democrats and Chairman Nadler, the Democratic chairman of the committee, now has a chance to rethink his sprawling investigation. He says he hopes that Nadler recognizes that what may, quote, be political fodder for Democrats may not be good for our country. And I suspect, George, you are going to hear a lot of Republicans making this argument that the Democrats, should drop their investigations, which Republicans will argue are simply political and never ending, and that given that we now know some of Mueller's conclusions, that this should be the end of it. Democrats are going to, of course, fiercely disagree. You are likely to see them hone in on this one finding that we are learning today, on the fact that Mueller says he is unwilling to fully exonerate the president. Democrats will, of course, want to know why that is. What else does Mueller know that they don't know already?
Dan Abrams.
Yeah, the question, we have to separate this out into political and legal, right? I don't think it's any question that this letter is a political win for the president. You read through this letter, particularly the language from Barr and Rosenstein about obstruction of justice, big win, as Chris Christie points out, the Russia conspiracy aspect of this, a big win because you have Mueller also stating that. But when it comes to this language from the Attorney General saying that the Attorney General and Rod Rosenstein don't think that there was obstruction of justice, what is the impact of that? Meaning, what if it had been the reverse? If they had said, we do think there is, and therefore what? I mean, it still would rest in the hands of Congress. What the special counsel was saying is, we are not engaging in a traditional prosecutorial judgment. Why? Not because of the evidence, not because of what we found, but because the president can't be indicted. If you accept that, then you have to say, looking at the language from Barr and Rosenstein, that this is really just their opinion.
But that's why I want to get to, and I want to bring this to Terry Moran, too, because I'm going back to this idea of tension between Robert Mueller and the Attorney General there. Robert Mueller is saying the reason they didn't go further is because, in part, of this underlying judgment that the president can't be indicted for a crime while in office. Yet the Attorney General then and the Deputy Attorney General say they're reaching their conclusions irregardless of that finding.
Right, and their conclusion are based on two veteran prosecutors who know that you have to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, and if the president did not commit a crime, it's going to be difficult and operated within his constitutional authority in firing James Comey, for example, in public. It's going to be difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he had a corrupt intent to obstruct justice. The tension there, Chris Christie, I think, is right. In quoting me, which is that I don't think someone in Robert Mueller's position, his Eagle Scout sense of his job, staying within the four corners of it, I'm not the guy, I believe he thought, to make this call. I certainly am going to abide from my perspective on that, the Justice Department guidelines that a sitting president can't be indicted. But ultimately, the Attorney General is the constitutional officer there, and that is his call as well. I just think it's going to be difficult going forward to say, A, that there was collusion, or B, that you could win an obstruction case.
Mary Bruce, more reaction from Capitol Hill?
Yet Chairman Nadler now saying that Special Counsel Mueller clearly and explicitly is not exonerating the president, and he says we must hear from the Attorney General about his decision-making and see all the underlying evidence so that the American people can know the full facts. George, Democrats here have made very clear that they are going to use every tool at their disposal to get at this full report and the underlying evidence. That means using their subpoena power if necessary. It means bringing up the Attorney General to testify, bringing up Robert Mueller to testify, and some have suggested possibly even suing and going to court if they need to get to the bottom of all of this evidence. And George, I think it's important as we have this discussion about the difference between the political and the legal to also remind everyone of the different mandates here between what the special counsel was looking at and what Congress is investigating. The special counsel was mostly looking at the issue of criminal intent, while Congress has a much, much broader mandate looking into corruption, abuse of power, obstruction of justice. They have this huge sweeping mandate, and that is why they are continuing all of their investigations here while also saying that they need the full Mueller report and they want all of that evidence so that they can know what really the special counsel discovered.
Pierre Thomas.
George, you know, the thing I'm struck is that, look, this is a complete vindication on the issue of whether there was conspiracy with the Russians for the president and his campaign. But Mueller does make pretty clear, based on this summary, that he had some issues with actions that the president took. And reading from the summary from Barr, it says, quote, "For each of the relevant actions investigated, the report sets out evidence on both sides of the question and leaves unresolved what the special counsel views as difficult issues of law and fact." So there is going to be a pretty intense debate, and I'm sure the Democrats are going to try to push on what was the specific evidence that gave Mueller pause about the actions of the President of the United States.
Yeah, they're going to push on that. But Terry Moran, going back to Pierre's original point right there, one of the things we heard from the President, 200-something times over the last 22 months, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. Robert Mueller is backing the President up on that.
And this is, therefore, a moment in our history, right? Since the President was elected, there has been a shadow over this presidency. Some people have looked for it to end because of their belief that somehow his election was illegitimate because of the involvement of Russia. Robert Mueller, one of the most respected prosecutors in America, exhaustively investigated with the power of subpoena and access to signals intelligence, human intelligence, all kinds of things, and he did not find evidence that Trump or members of his campaign conspired or coordinated with Russia. That is huge. It is something, frankly, that Americans should be happy about, that the president was not assisted by Russia. I doubt that's going to happen. But this is a conclusive determination as quoted. This is not Barr's spin. This is Barr quoting directly Robert Mueller.
Let me bring in Congressman Eric Swalwell, a member of the House Judiciary Committee, for his reaction to that. You just heard Terry Moran there, Congressman Swalwell. Special counsel found no evidence, did not conclude that there was any conspiracy to work with the Russians by the Trump team.
Well, I think it's a little early to understand whether there was some evidence that could not be proved beyond a reasonable doubt of conspiracy or coordination. Certainly the standard is what you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And that was not met. And that, I would agree, is good for the country.
Right. And that is Special Counsel Robert Mueller's conclusion, not the Attorney General's.
Correct. So what we would like to see is the findings of Mueller and the grand jury material that existed, particularly from an intelligence committee standpoint, because we have an interest with the counterintelligence mission to understand if any individuals, including the president, did work with the Russians, perhaps in a way that couldn't be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, but a way that we'd want to know.
And then on the second question of obstruction of justice, the Republican leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy, has now said this is case closed. Your reaction?
Well, this is just the beginning, because the House Judiciary Committee will have a responsibility to look at that conduct. Now, I respect Attorney General Barr's ability to not pursue that conduct, but the House has a different responsibility, and we will want to see what conduct Special Counsel Mueller said had some of the tougher decisions that would have to be made. And so it's case closed criminally, but not case closed as far as did the president commit a high crime or misdemeanor.
So what is your next step?
To see the whole report. Every sentence, every word, every comma. Let the American people digest it as well. Thank Special Counsel Mueller for the years that he dedicated and the team who worked with him, but now the work moves to the Congress.
And just finally, do you accept again on that question of the special counsel's conclusion that there was no one in the Trump team engaged in a conspiracy despite multiple offers from the Russians? Doesn't that vindicate or at least support the president's contention all along that there was no collusion?
I support the fact that the special counsel is saying he cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt conspiracy or collusion. What I would like to see is was there evidence that cannot be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest standard in the law, but that was still in existence, that people sought to work with the Russians? Because we all have seen some of the public evidence where they sought to work with the Russians that may not be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's still concerning if you're an American and you see your president, his team, his family seeking to draw themselves so close to the Russians.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, thanks very much. Let me go to John Karl.
Yeah, George, we've been briefed over the past several weeks, really since the Democrats took over the House of Representatives, about various committees' plans to move forward with investigations on a range of issues. Many of those investigations have really not even begun to get started. But on this question...
John, hold on a second, because we have Jay Sekulow, one of the president's attorneys, on the phone right now, and I want to get him. Let me come back to you. Mr. Sekulow, thank you for joining us right now. Your reaction to the report.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you there, George. Sorry.
Jay, thank you for joining us. Just wanted to get your initial reaction to the letter from and the principal conclusions of Robert Mueller.
Very pleased. I think both, as we've said from the outset of this whole entire inquiry, that there was no collusion and there was no obstruction. And both the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, and the special counsel acknowledged there was no collusion, which, of course, was the basis upon which this entire inquiry started. No evidence of any collusion between the Trump campaign, the president, or anyone else in the Russian government or Russian agents. So that's number one. And on the obstruction, you can't be any clearer. There was no obstruction. And they said that is as crystal clear as it could be, and in fact made a legal conclusion based on their existing policies, absent the fact. This has nothing to do with the fact, George, that you can't indict a sitting president. They were very clear to point that out.
That was the point that they made. How do you respond to the quote from the special counsel that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him?
Well, because their job in that context was to just lay out the facts, and they did. This was exactly what I anticipated, because you don't know until you see it, that they would lay out the facts and not draw legal conclusions, leave it to the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel to make those conclusions. Because remember, unlike an independent counsel, this is a special counsel. They're governed by the prosecutorial guidelines and policies of the Department of Justice. So that merely falls into that precedent.
You just heard Congressman Eric Swalwell say that they want to see the complete report and the underlying evidence. The president himself told John Karl.
I didn't hear the congressman because I was on.
Okay, then I'll just.
But I take your word for it.
Okay, he said that the president himself told John Karl last week that he wants the entire report out as well. The House of Representatives voted 420-0 to have the entire report out. Does the president still believe that the entire report should be released?
Well, I'm not going to. The president believes that it's the Attorney General's responsibility to determine what should be released and what is appropriate to release. I will say this. I don't think anybody, including the congressman, can complain about the speed in which the Attorney General and his team turned this report around. He received the report on Friday, and here we are Sunday at 4:10, and we're discussing what the special report that basically the Attorney General's office put together in a very short order. So with regard to the report, that's a decision under the regulations that the Attorney General of the United States will make. We respect his determination, and whatever that will be. That's not something that we would be involved in, especially as private counsel.
As you know, Mr. Sekulow, that the president has the authority to order the Attorney General to do that. Are you saying he's not going to make that
order? No, I'm not opining on that at all, because we represent the president in his private capacity. Those are decisions that will be made by the Attorney General, and of course, I'm sure the White House counsel would have the right to weigh in on what they deem to be appropriate.
And you feel this is a win?
Not just a win. The entire basis upon which this inquiry was instituted was a concern over collusion between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. Bob Mueller and the Department of Justice could not be clearer. And you could not obstruct. This was important on the obstruction aspect. When you read the conclusions, to have the obstruction issue even as a viable one, which it was not, there'd have to be an underlying crime, which there wasn't. So when you look at this from a legal standpoint, it's very clear this is a complete win for the president. I think it's a win for the American people. They had a thorough investigation, and it's now concluded.
Jay Sekulow, thank you for your time right now. I'm going to go to
George.
Cecilia Vega at the White House. An official statement from the White House?
Yeah, George, just coming in from the press pool that's traveling with the president in Florida. This is from Sarah Sanders, and it says, quote, "The special counsel did not find any collusion and did not find any obstruction. Attorney General Barr and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein further determined there was no obstruction. The findings of the Department of Justice are a total and complete exoneration of the President of the United States." Not surprised that that's the reaction coming in from the White House right now. This is a day that could very well shape the rest of Donald Trump's presidency here in this White House. This has been a cloud hanging over this administration for 22 months. Every single day, just about, we heard President Trump talk about witch hunt, no collusion. He said just as recently as Friday, no obstruction. This will probably have them, frankly, cheering here when they come back from Mar-a-Lago later today. And we also know, George, that this is something that is going to really shape the battle for 2020. This is going to be a huge point going forward. And the RNC is already weighing in, echoing what we just heard from the White House, saying no collusion. And they go on to quote a who's who of Democrats and all the comments that they've made about Robert Mueller over the last 2 years, everyone from Maxine Waters to Bernie Sanders. And they say they guaranteed us that Special Counsel Mueller would find proof of it, of no collusion. They were wrong.
Big day for President Trump, it appears. Cecilia Vega, thanks very much. Want to go to Chairman Rance for some final thoughts?
Well, it will no question be a main issue in the 2020 campaign, and it has cemented the trust that millions of Americans have for President Trump. He said for years there was no collusion, they're going to find anything, and in fact, that appears to be what after this investigation has happened. For the Democrats, they've got all these candidates out there who no longer want to fight the battle on Trump and Russia. They've got their own ideas. They're dreaming big policies that they have for the United States. They need to get that message to the voters. So there could be a tension between the eagerness of House Democrats to investigate the president and some of those campaigns which want to get positive ideas before the voters, where they might have a better chance now than attacking the president on his character or on his conduct on Russia.
And Mary Bruce, we're only getting initial indications so far from Democrats on Capitol Hill. We just heard from Congressman Swalwell, from the chairman of the House Judiciary, Gerald Nadler. For right now, full speed ahead.
Absolutely, even more so now. And we are hearing more even from Chairman Nadler of the House Judiciary Committee. He seems to be questioning the timing of all of this, tweeting that the special counsel worked for 22 months to determine the extent to which the president may have obstructed justice, and that the attorney general then just took 2 days to tell the American people those findings. And he goes on to say that the Justice Department owes the public more than just a brief synopsis. Democrats here are going to continue to hammer away on why they feel they need the full report, the underlying evidence, and they are likely going to bring up the Attorney General himself to testify. They could bring up Robert Mueller as they try to get to the bottom of this. We are also hearing from some of those Democratic candidates, many of them also out there on the campaign trail over the weekend, calling for this full report to be made public. Senator Cory Booker, one of the presidential contenders, saying that this needs to be, the full report needs to come out because, quote, an in-house, that they need more than just a, quote, in-house summary from a Trump administration official.
Mary Bruce, thanks very much. And John Carl, the president's been pretty quiet this weekend. That's not likely to last.
Not at all, George. The interesting thing will be listen for how his tone when speaking about Robert Mueller has changed. He has spent 22 months vilifying the special counsel, vilifying the investigation as a witch hunt by Robert Mueller and what he would sometimes call the 17 angry Democrats working with him. Now the White House is pointing to Robert Mueller and the special counsel as the paragons on this, as the ultimate word, and the ultimate word being, as far as the White House is concerned, one of vindication.
Dan Abrams, is this the last word?
Well, so if you view Robert Mueller as the final word, right, up to this point, everyone has said, well, let's wait for Mueller. Let's wait for Mueller. Here's where Congressman Swalwell understated what was found in the report. It says the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. It doesn't say we couldn't prove it. It doesn't say we couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. It says that they did not establish. That's big in terms of Robert Mueller being the final word. And yet, on the other hand, Jay Sekulow is overstating a bit what Robert Mueller is saying about obstruction of justice, because there the final word is really just coming in an opinion of Attorney General Barr and Rod Rosenstein in their evaluation of the evidence. That is not what Robert Mueller concluded. Robert Mueller did not reach a conclusion on that. And so when you view Robert Mueller as the final word on all of this, the answer is no question on collusion, coordination with the Russians. Big win for President Trump. On obstruction of justice, unclear.
Pierre Thomas, remarkable thing here. We're talking about Robert Mueller. We're seeing what he wrote right here. We never heard from the man in 22 months.
We did not, George. And I think it's really useful to go back to some reporting I did early on. And I remember a source telling me that at the end of the day, good or bad, that Robert Mueller would be the president's best friend if he found no evidence of collusion. Because the man his integrity is impeccable. He was known as probably one of the most unique figures in Washington, confirmed twice by the Senate to be FBI director, 100-0. In this town, that's virtually impossible. And they won't be able to say that he did not investigate thoroughly. If you look at the numbers, and it's the first time we're sharing them, 2,800 subpoenas. They interviewed more than 500 witnesses, and they made requests of 13 foreign governments for evidence, and they found no evidence of collusion.
That's the big headline there from Robert Mueller on the issue of obstruction of justice. He says he could not conclude that the president committed a crime, does not exonerate him, but the attorney general and his deputy going further, saying they believe that the president did not commit obstruction of justice. Those are the big conclusions from this report today. We're going to have our coverage continue right now on ABC News Live, our 24/7 streaming channel. Of course, a full report tonight on World News Tonight. I'm George Stephanopoulos in New York.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Perfect setup for that Diva bomb explosion. The rest of the shot.
Report 22-month investigation. John Santucci, our investigative reporter, Catherine Folder's White House reporter as well, here to break this down for us, guys. And let's start right with the report. Two major headlines, John, in this report on obstruction and on collusion.
Yeah, so we see right there from the outset, there from the Attorney General's letter up to Capitol Hill, that the president is clear of obstruction of justice. Says that they looked into this charge, said that even though this is not a full exoneration, that there's nothing they could actually charge him with. That is a big headline, as we know. And collusion, which the Trump campaign and others, Devin, as we know, every single day we're saying, we already got a statement from Donald Trump Jr. saying that we've been saying this forever. We didn't collude. We didn't do anything. Clear as day. Nothing that the Attorney General could write about or the special counsel Robert Mueller found over his 22-month-long investigation to say there was collusion.
Our Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre Thomas, who's been on this story the whole way, joins us now. Pierre, what's your reaction personally as a reporter that's been covering this? Is this a big surprise to you?
You know, I just shared with George Stephanopoulos something that someone had told me early on in connection with this investigation, which is that at the end of the day, if there was no collusion found, Bob Mueller would be the president's best friend because that his integrity is impeccable. He's a man that's unique in Washington, confirmed to be FBI director 100-0 twice. No one like him, and because they did a thorough investigation, over 2,800 subpoenas issued, they engaged with 13 different countries, interviewed more than 500 witnesses, and Bob Mueller, not anyone else, not Rod Rosenstein, not the Attorney General picked by the president, Bob Mueller concluded that there was no evidence of a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russians. That is the most dominant headlines that comes out of the story. Now, on the issue of obstruction, that's a little bit more of a mixed bag in the sense that Mueller himself found there was some evidence and some things that obviously concerned him. Other things that made him less concerned. And he left that to the Attorney General to make the final call about whether there should be at least the notion of obstruction of justice considered. But again, for a country that has for nearly 2 years wondered if anyone in the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians, you got a definitive answer today from Bob Mueller that that did not take place.
All right, Chief White House correspondent, Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas, thanks so much, Pierre, for that reporting, and much more from you on World News Tonight. Joining us now on the phone is former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, ABC News contributor, former federal prosecutor. Governor, I want to ask you about the final page of this letter from Bill Barr to Congress, where the Attorney General says he is still actively considering what more to release from this report, the details that aren't in this 4-page letter. How much of it do you think Bill Barr should release?
I think the important part is to say that he has said he believes that that it is in the public interest to release as much of the report as possible. So I think Bill Barr is going to try to release as much as he can, but he very astutely and directly points to Rule 6E, which is the rule that limits disclosure of grand jury information. And that's not something the President of the United States can even waive. This is Bill Barr's determination. If something is under Rule 6E, it cannot be made public. It is against the law for it to be made public. And so if it's grand jury information which was not contained in a previous charging document, they can't release the information. And he says specifically in there he's going to want Bob Mueller's help on what information in the report is from grand jury information and what is not. And he will release, I believe he's going to release everything that's not grand jury information or intelligence that would compromise the United States publicly. Now, this is where I thought that Speaker Pelosi's refusal to get an intelligence briefing on this was a strange decision, trying to force Bill Barr's hand to send more things out publicly, which might in fact be counter to the national security interests of the United States. So I think we've already seen the Democrats who have been very vocal on this are desperate now to try to go in another direction, because I would say, and I differ a little bit from what Pierre just told you on obstruction. I think it is important that Robert Mueller did not find the president committed a crime.
Well, yeah, but
now that's really important, that he found he didn't commit a crime. He didn't say that he couldn't indict him because of constitutional restraints. That's not what he said. He said there's nothing in the report that says that the president's conduct constitutes a crime. He did not exonerate him. Well, that's not his job to exonerate him. When we're prosecutors, our job is to decide, is someone commit a crime or didn't they? And he determined that the president, on both conspiracy, on collusion, and obstruction, did not commit a crime. This is a complete home run for the president.
Well, Chris, on that, before we let you go, Governor Chris Christie joining us here by the phone. What do you make, though, of the line here from Attorney General Bill Barr saying the special counsel did not draw a conclusion one way or the other as to whether the conduct constituted obstruction? That really does seem to leave the question open, though, doesn't it?
Well, he didn't. If he thought that it committed a crime, he would have said that. It says in there, if you look at the letter, and we've got to go back to page 3 on this. The special counsel, at the end of the first paragraph, the special counsel states, while this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. So it doesn't. The report does not conclude the president committed a crime. That's a huge finding for the president. Because if Bob Mueller thought he committed a crime, he would have said so. Now, he may not have been able to indict him under Justice Department rules, but it would not have precluded Mueller from saying, listen, I think a crime was committed here, as Ken Starr did in the Bill Clinton-Veronica Lewinsky report, where he found that the president, in that case President Bill Clinton, did commit the crime of perjury. And so it doesn't preclude the special counsel from finding a crime's been committed, just as in Ken Starr's case. They couldn't bring an indictment against the sitting president, but they did not make a finding that his conduct constituted a crime. That's a big win for the president.
It is indeed, especially coming from someone you know well. Governor Chris Christie knows Bob Mueller very well and has been very affirming of his work thus far in the investigation. Thanks so much, Governor Christie, joining us on the phone. Let's go over to the White House now. Senior White House correspondent Cecilia Vega is there. She has been tracking the president's responses. We haven't heard from the president himself on this directly, Cecilia, but White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders is weighing in.
Yeah, exactly, Devin. Pretty uncharacteristic restraint, really, from the president so far, but I imagine it's probably just a few more minutes before we do hear something from him. He is about to make his way, a little delayed it seems, from Mar-a-Lago back to the White House. Of course, there are the reporters, the journalists, the White House press corps who always travels with him, so there will be an opportunity for him to address the media fairly shortly, I imagine. But you mentioned that statement from the White House and Sarah Sanders. Let's just go back at it. And she says, the findings of the Department of Justice are a total and complete exoneration of the President of the United States. So unanimous from just about every ally of the president's, including from his press secretary here at the White House. But I also want to bring your attention to something else that Sarah Sanders just sent around to journalists. She passed along a list of the key findings in Barr's letter, and she highlights, of course, the line about there was no Russian collusion, and she highlights the line that says our determination that there was no obstruction. But she left out the line that says the special counsel states that while the report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. So I'm not surprised on that one, I suppose, but they're sort of selectively at this point highlighting the lines that benefit them at this point. But, you know, I've got to say, Devin, and we've been reporting this over the last couple of days, that our reporting is, according to people who've talked to the president down in Mar-a-Lago, that he's been in just a great mood and certainly coming home tonight will be feeling the same way.
Yeah, he hit the golf course today with some of his close buddies from Congress and the administration, no doubt in good spirits right now as well. Cecilia Vega, senior White House correspondent, thanks so much for that. And Catherine, there is sort of some irony in all of this because President Trump has spent months bashing Bob Mueller, the credibility of Bob Mueller, and now today we expect, when we will start hearing from him soon as he leaves Florida, he will be embracing Bob Mueller's conclusions.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, John and Devin, to see how his tone switches on this. You already see some of his close allies saying, like the president's attorney did, that they're very pleased with this. I was just talking to somebody close to the president who said that he thinks that Mueller is the good guy now. So we will expect to hear a lot of that from the president and his allies.
Well, let's go to someone that knows the president quite well. We're joined right now by former White House counsel Ty Cobb. He was there for a big chunk of this investigation. Ty, great to have you joining us this afternoon. Your initial reactions to the letter from Attorney General Barr.
Well, it's great to be with you. I think my initial response is that I think the letter reflects a degree of professionalism on the part of the special counsel and on behalf of the Justice Department, as the letter made plain that there was an enormous investigative effort, thousands of search warrants, interviews, pen registers, subpoenas, et cetera, et cetera. Those people worked very, very hard over the past 2 years, and apparently without any Justice Department resistance or interference, as was indicated by the initial letter. So I think that the Attorney General, this is a very professional explanation. I think he summarized the report quite well and identified the difficulties with how much more material he will be able to provide, but committed himself in his confirmation hearing to being as transparent as possible.
Hey, Ty, it's Catherine Folders. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Ty, so you were there at the White House during that critical period, that 9-month period where you were focused on turning over all those documents to the special counsel. I think over 1 million pages of documents, if you include those from the campaign. At times you got a lot of flack for that transparency. Do you think the outcome of this would have been any different if you hadn't been, as you say, this transparent with Mueller?
Well, so I think the one thing that lawyers make a mistake doing is taking credit or even blame sometimes when, as always in these cases, the facts really dictate the result. I think that the cooperation, which the president deserves credit for, because he was from the outset insisted that he had done nothing wrong and wanted his people to fully cooperate and wanted the White House to fully cooperate. I think that strategy was the appropriate one, and I think that it had an impact, to a great extent on various twists and turns in the in the investigative process, but ultimately facilitated the special counsel's ability to get to the bottom line.
All right, former White House lawyer Ty Cobb joining us on the phone. Ty, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate your perspective all the way through. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, John Karl, now, who's been standing by and, of course, reporting on this the whole way. John, I want to ask you a little bit about what's next. We've been hearing over and over again today from Democrats atop many of the committees that they expect to pursue this all the way. They want the details underlying this summary. They want to make determinations of their own. What do you think the odds are that they will actually get their hands on that stuff?
Well, they're not going to get anywhere near what they want, but I think there will be an epic battle over getting the full Mueller report and the supportive materials. But look, one fundamental thing here, Devin, I think it's going to be very difficult for Democrats to make the case for reopening and aggressively pursuing an investigation into the central question of collusion with Russian efforts to interfere with the election. It's hard to make the case, as Democrats, as you know, you and I have both sat down with key Democrats on Capitol Hill about their plans for investigations in the coming months. There certainly is plenty to investigate when it comes to the Trump administration, but I think that it will be a tough case to make that they can go further through their committees on this issue of Russian collusion than Robert Mueller has after 22 months with nearly unlimited resources, no real time constraints, subpoena power, and all of that to make the case that they need to relitigate that question. Now, on the question of what Congress will get from the Mueller, from the Mueller report, if you look at the letter from Barr, he says on page 4, my goal and intent is to release as much of the special counsel's report as I can, consistent with applicable law, regulations, and departmental policies. So that last part of that sentence is an important one. They will argue that no grand jury material can be turned over to Congress. They will argue that no material regarding third parties, people that were not charged with crimes, can be turned over to Congress, and of course anything that's classified. And in those three categories, you can find a lot that can be redacted and prevented from going to Congress.
Yeah, Bill Barr poured through all that material pretty quickly, just in 2 days' time, to put out that 4-page summary. And we expect now that this, as you say, John, will take some time for them to determine and fight over what should come out. Our chief White House correspondent, John Karl, thanks so much, John, for that. As we look at live picture right now of Air Force One sitting on the tarmac down in Florida, we're awaiting President Trump returning to Washington after his weekend in Mar-a-Lago. We know he spent the afternoon out there on the golf course. Here is this major news has just come down. If you're just joining us here on ABC News Live, the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, has delivered to Congress and to the public a 4-page letter summarizing, in his view, the context, the principal conclusions of Robert Mueller's 22-month investigation, both into Russian interference in the 2016 campaign and allegations of obstruction of justice. On the former, Russian interference, Mueller said there was no knowing coordination between anyone in Trump's orbit and the Russians. On the obstruction question, he said basically he's not going to decide. There's evidence on both sides. He's going to leave that to the policymakers to take a look at that. And John Santucci, our senior investigative reporter, is here. Senior justice reporter Jack Date is here as well. And John, you're hearing from the president's personal legal team their initial reaction after months of tangling with Bob Mueller over this very report.
Yeah, Jay Sekulow, the president's top litigator, is telling us it's his complete and total win based on this letter from Attorney General Bill Barr. He spoke earlier to ABC's George Stephanopoulos on an earlier special report. Let's take a listen to what Jay told George.
As you know, Mr. Sekulow, that the president has the authority to order the attorney general to do that. Are you saying he's not going to make that order?
No, I'm not opining on that at all, because we represent the president in his private capacity. Those are decisions that will be made by the attorney general, and of course, I'm sure the White House counsel would have the right to weigh in on what they deem to be appropriate.
And you feel this is a win?
A complete, not just a win. The entire basis upon which this inquiry was instituted was a concern over collusion between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. Bob Mueller and the Department of Justice could not be clearer. And you could not obstruct. This was important on the obstruction aspect. When you read the conclusions, to have the obstruction issue even as a viable one, which it was not, there'd have to be an underlying crime, which there wasn't.
Jason.
So when you look at this from a legal standpoint, it's very clear this is a complete win for the president. I think it's a win for the American people.
Jay Sekulow, the president's personal attorney, speaking earlier here on ABC with George Stephanopoulos. And Devin, he said many times that they're very pleased by this report, said, as we said from the offset of this whole entire inquiry, there was no collusion and there was no obstruction.
And the president's legal team had been very forthcoming at the beginning of this process. Almost 2 years ago, they then sort of pulled back a little bit, had some tussles with Bob Mueller over that course in time. But as we learned in this letter just today, Jack Date, Bob Mueller had his hands on a heck of a lot of documents and talked to an unbelievable number of people in this process. We have, I think, by the numbers ready to take a look at here.
Absolutely. The effort that's laid out here is absolutely exhaustive. He had 19 lawyers, 40 FBI agents, intelligence analysts, accountants, forensic analysts. He had 2,800 subpoenas, executed 500 search warrants, and there's communication orders. That means phone records, things like that. 230 orders for that. 13 requests of foreign governments for information, and approximately 500 witnesses interviewed. No stone was unturned.
500 witnesses interviewed, and John, you know, many of the people in the Trump orbit met with Mueller multiple times, so this was very extensive.
But what gets me about that number 500, Devin, is that, you know, we were trying over the several months, and Jack knows this, trying to keep count of who was going in and meeting with the special counsel's team for interviews, and some of them actually going for testimony before the grand jury. We never got anywhere near the number 500, and it speaks to the integrity of special counsel Robert Mueller, that nothing leaked from this investigation. Nobody had any little tips of what he was up to or where he was going. And we saw over the course of 22 months, this investigation went in many ways that we were not expecting as it went on. And it's a real credit to Mueller and the team that he assembled.
And Terry Moran, our senior national correspondent, let's talk about the politics of all of this as we go forward here. So much of the country had pent-up expectations for this report. It's hard to quibble with, as John was just saying, such an expansive, extensive investigation. Now we have the findings, and one imagines that this will be a hot topic during the 2020 presidential campaign.
Oh, yeah. But I think we can take a step back and say that the first winner here, and it's a win really maybe for the country and its very divided politics altogether. The first winner here is the rule of law in the United States of America, right? What Jack just read us, that exhaustive list of powers, authorities, resources, effort that really one of the sterling prosecutors in our history, Robert Mueller, had used in order to investigate this very serious question. Did the current president of the United States assist the Kremlin in attacking our country? And he came up with this clear answer. Now, right now, people want to see more. They want to see the underlying evidence. That'll come. But I think the first thing that will happen is, hey, the system works. Now, politically, that's going to help Donald Trump. Look, he's going to say this every single day, and he's going to say it about the media. He's going to say, they are fake news. I'm the one who said for 2 straight years there was no collusion. They came after me. I'm right. You can trust me. For Democrats, there's this risk if they continue down this path of he's illegitimate. Don't you hate him too? That is going to be a much more difficult case to make. I think they're much better off because they're doing the hard work of coming up with very creative policies to answer the real problems people have of getting this campaign onto substance. That may be where Trump is vulnerable, not Russia anymore.
And for now, Terry, as you alluded to a little bit earlier, sort of I would imagine a big sigh of relief in many corners of the country that this is simply over for now, although the fight over the details, the underlying material will continue. Thanks for that, Terry. I know you're going to stand by. Let's bring in our Supreme Court and legal analyst, Kate Shaw, now for a little more on the fight over that underlying material that will continue to unfold in the weeks ahead, certainly on Capitol Hill, but also potentially in the court. Kate, great to have you with us. I wanted to ask you, you also worked in a White House counsel's office during the Obama administration, have some familiarity with investigations like these. To what extent do you think Bob Mueller wrote this confidential report knowing that it could potentially come out in the political realm?
You know, I'm sure he wrote it with every expectation that eventually it would be released. Now, that may or may not be true, but you have to write with the expectation that there's at least a good chance it will be. And I have to say that just in the last hour or so, as you know, various guests of yours and elsewhere have been sort of trying to figure out how to parse some of the sentences in the Barr memo, we sort of see exactly why the Democrats on the Hill are going to call so quickly for the full report to be released, because some of it is hard to sort of figure out how to parse, right? Particularly the discussion of obstruction of justice, right? So Governor Christie talked about a total exoneration on obstruction of justice, said Mueller concluded the president didn't obstruct justice. And, you know, I think there's also a reading of that section of the Barr report that's quite different, that says Mueller very much decided not to reach a conclusion either way, and that there was a lot of evidence pointing in both directions, which means some evidence at least pointing toward, yes, he did obstruct justice. And I think the Democrats are going to say the report itself doesn't answer a lot of the key questions. And so this report, that is. And so we all need to see the full or virtually full version of what Mueller wrote so we can see whether what Barr gave to the Hill and to the public was a fair representation of Mueller's actual findings, in particular on obstruction. I do think that, at least from the Barr summary, the question of whether there was collusion is pretty definitively established, at least as Mueller was able to do it, that there just isn't evidence that the campaign colluded or conspired with Russia. But obstruction, I think, is a lot hazier right now.
Kate Shaw, appreciate it very much. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. If you're just tuning in, we are doing live coverage right now of the Attorney General's report to Capitol Hill. We finally have heard from President Trump. He just tweeted moments ago, writing, "No collusion, no obstruction, complete and total exoneration. Keep America great." Devin, least surprising tweet ever of the Trump presidency.
He is a very happy man, as we see live picture of Air Force One on the tarmac there in Florida, getting ready to come back to Washington. We expect the president will address reporters on his way out of town there. So stand by with us here on ABC News Live as we await the president's first on-camera, in-person reaction to this news from Attorney General Bill Barr on the conclusions, in his view, of the Mueller report. And Jack, you were just sort of also weighing in on some of this.
And I think, as the president says, no collusion, as he often does now. He's got a good reason to say it. But the letter also makes reference to multiple efforts or multiple offers from Russian-affiliated individuals to assist the Trump campaign. It found that really those offers weren't really accepted or engaged with, but Democrats are certainly going to want to know way more about what those offers were. Some of them we're going to see play out. They're going to want to know a lot about that. And also,
that is a tantalizing, just to underscore, a very tantalizing line in this letter suggests that there were active attempts to, and we knew some of this, but active attempts by the Russians to recruit and actively engage Trump officials. Robert Mueller concluded they didn't do that knowingly, but
and we still don't know some of the answers as to why so many officials and people associated in the Trump orbit lied. You know, some of them have been convicted for their lies related to this investigation. And why did they do that? And we don't know the answers to that.
And we don't yet, but we are getting a lot of reaction to the top lines in this report. Democrats calling for full transparency. They want the whole thing released publicly. There will be a fight to come on that. Republicans largely taking a victory lap right now. We're joined by our correspondent, Lana Zach, who's been doing some reporting on this. Just got off the phone with Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the president's allies. What's his view?
And he was right there with the president. Actually, he got off the phone because he said the president was coming up the steps. So he hasn't talked to President Trump yet about that. But he says that this is a big win for the president. And clearly, I think when you contrast what we saw on Friday with Democrats and Republicans all saying transparency, transparency, give us as much of this report as possible. Today, I feel like we're hearing a little bit less of that from the Democrats. They still want to know what's behind it, but they're ready, I think, in many ways to move on, in part because this 4-page document lays it out very clearly. It says that on the #1 charge, that there was collusion with Russia, that is not something that the president was involved in. It's clear that that the president and his allies, like Senator Lindsey Graham, who is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and one of the principal people for whom this letter was written, that they all feel like that means they know that there was nothing there as far as a smoking gun. done. And then on the secondary question about whether or not the president obstructed justice, we know since Robert Mueller says that this report didn't exonerate him and left the decision making then to AG Barr and Rod Rosenstein, they have said they're not going to pursue anything because they didn't have anything fundamentally under number one, that charge.
And hold that thought, Lana, because we are seeing right now President Trump for the first time walking over to cameras. Looks like he's about to make his first comments in person on the Mueller report. Let's listen in.
So after a long look, after a long investigation, after so many people have been so badly hurt, after not looking at the other side, where a lot of bad things happened, a lot of horrible things happened, a lot of very bad things happened for our country. It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration. It's a shame that our country had to go through this. To be honest, it's a shame that your president has had to go through this before I even got elected. It began. And it began illegally. And hopefully somebody's going to look at the other side. This was an illegal takedown that failed. And hopefully somebody's going to be looking at the other side. So it's complete exoneration, no collusion, no obstruction. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Very emphatic, saying perhaps what we would expect to hear from him, but reiterating no collusion, no obstruction. Obviously, he, in his words, John Santucci, a complete and total exoneration. In many ways, this was an exoneration, although we should say on the question of obstruction of justice, Robert Mueller making very clear that he had decided not to decide on that in this report. We have not seen the underlying evidence. Certainly a good day for the president.
It's quoting, it says the special counsel states, quote, while this report, meaning this is the special counsel's report to the Attorney General, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. That is not the conclusion of Bob Mueller.
We have to remember, though, for Donald Trump, he's going to pick out what he wants from this report. So for him, this is a total victory. It was a complete shame, as he said multiple times, that the country, and then, of course, the president, always bringing it back to himself, had to go through this. But then also saying that the other side needs to be looked at. You know, of course, so many times
it was an illegal takedown, a shame the country had to go through this. But Jack, as someone who covers the Justice Department, and to our viewers, just as a reminder, this whole 22-month investigation began back during the 2016, not explicitly because of President Trump, but because of Russian interference, which the intelligence community confirmed the president at times has begrudgingly accepted. But that was sort of the impetus here, and over the course of that investigation, the president got caught up in it, got woven into it. But really, it's the Russians here. And there were indictments of dozens of Russians by Bob Mueller for that interference.
Over 2 dozen,
It did happen.
And Trump associates as well.
Right.
Several guilty pleas that came out of that. And this letter says that Russia did, in fact, try to sow discord and did try and affect our election, that was absolutely something that happened. It just wasn't that President Trump was involved in it.
And let's go now to live reaction on the ground in Florida, where the president spent the weekend. Our White House correspondent Tara Palmieri has been down there talking to her sources around the president. Tara, as we see the president just getting ready to depart Florida, you have gotten a pretty good pulse on his mood. We just saw it firsthand, but he's been taking a victory lap behind the scenes there at Mar-a-Lago.
It seems that way from the people that are around him, that he is happy, elated. He wanted to speak to the press before he took off. He was supposed to leave at 4:30. Now it's closer to 5, so he took some time to really take in the report, and he wanted to make a statement to the press. But what we saw was actually very rare. The president making a statement and walking on, not answering questions. As you know, too, Devin, from covering this administration, President Trump likes to engage with the press. He likes that combative tone. He didn't attack the press either the way that he usually does, the way that his son did in his first statement, Donald Trump Jr. He blamed the mainstream media for the Russia collusion investigation, and the president did not. In fact, he just made a statement and walked on. So it's very rare to see the president do that. I expect that we'll hear more from him when he lands, but I'm certainly shocked to see him acting this way.
Tara, that's two. I'm with you as well on that. I was surprised that he didn't go after any fake news or anything like that. But Tara, you and I were reporting out the reaction and the vibe down in Mar-a-Lago from this weekend. Both of us hearing that he was in a great mood, feeling as though the cloud had been lifted over him. What shocked me, though, Tara, and I know you have been working sources, as have I, in the last couple of minutes since this report has come out from the Attorney General, is that he didn't say anything about Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Many people I spoke to thought he would almost compliment the Special Counsel after months of attacking him, thinking that he actually did a good job now, exonerated him, proved innocent in his opinion. Did that stand out to you as well, Tara?
It seems that calculus has shifted. Until the report came out, the president made it his goal to pin Robert Mueller as a partisan hack, someone that couldn't be trusted. Now that his report seems to show that he's not guilty of Russian collusion and not even making the determination that he obstructed justice, he's now going to stand by Robert Mueller because, as you hear already from the Democrats, they want more. They want evidence. They want to retrace Robert Mueller's investigation. And so how will the president stop that except by standing by Robert Mueller and saying he's an honorable man, he's not a partisan, look at what he put forward. So I expect that you either won't hear him speaking about Mueller, or you may hear him speak more graciously about the man that he at one time saw as a threat.
And he will have to continue treading carefully on his very public promise to our John Carl just several days ago that he wants the public to see the full report. We do suspect that in the days ahead, those words will be put back to him. As the White House has been saying today, they think it's up to Attorney General Bill Barr to decide what, if anything, further should be released. But Kate Shaw, I want to go back to you, our legal analyst and former White House counsel office staffer. Big question that I have is, could President Trump order this report released in full if he wanted to on his own, override the regulations?
Devin, so certainly he could choose not to assert any kind of executive privilege to keep some parts of the report back. And as to portions of the report that contain classified information, really the president has the ability to override any kind of determination regarding national security information and classification. So in theory, he could order all of that publicly released too. And I think the one exception might be a statute prohibiting the release of grand jury information. So unless he wanted to challenge the constitutionality of that statute to suggest that he had the inherent constitutional authority to order all of it released, which might set up a sort of dispute between Congress and the president, all of that might have to be carved out. But as to everything else in the report, I think, tomorrow or as quickly as they could sort of segregate out the grand jury information, the president could order the report released. And I think it will be interesting to see the White House's approach in the next few days, because as you just said, the president, without having seen the report, seemed, to kind of commit himself to promoting it as much public release as possible. But, I don't think we know if the report tracks perfectly. I mean, what we saw was Attorney General Barr's summary of what is in the report and what he found relevant, and his recommendation and conclusion as to obstruction of justice. So it may be that if the president and his staffers sift through the report itself, which is, of course, much longer than the 4 pages that we saw today, and decides that there is damaging information there. I mean, look, even the cover memo that Barr wrote makes reference to significant information supporting the conclusion that the president obstructed justice. So the president may get cold feet about supporting public release if, in fact, his staff members take a look and think, well, there's actually some pretty damaging stuff here, even if Mueller didn't recommend a finding of obstruction, and if Barr affirmatively recommended, or determined that there was no obstruction of justice. So I think that, we'll know a lot in the next couple of days as we see whether the White House sort of stays on this release as much as possible line or retreats a little bit from it.
And they do have the guidelines on their side on this one, since the report itself was to be confidential, sort of as a baseline. So it'll be interesting to see that. Kate Shaw, our legal analyst, thanks so much for joining us by phone. If you're just joining us here on ABC News Live, of course, you've by now heard the breaking news from this town that the Attorney General Bill Barr has delivered his 4-page summary of Robert Mueller's 22-month report into Russian interference into the 2016 election, potential obstruction of justice by President Trump to Capitol Hill. They have that letter. We have that letter. Those findings in large part exonerating President Trump, and now posing some new questions as to what comes next. The Capitol Hill crew, Lana Zach, among them is sort of gauging reaction up there. Democrats going to be holding some hearings, potentially even calling Bob Mueller to testify in the weeks ahead.
Bob Mueller, I think we will also be listening to see if the Attorney General, William Barr, is going to be called forward. And I'm also going to be wondering if this is going to be in full public view or if these hearings are going to take place behind closed doors. For Democrats, if this report really did exonerate President Trump, it makes more sense for them to have their due diligence, ask their questions, and then move on, really get themselves...
and they'll also want to talk to this man, Attorney General Bill Barr. We have some exclusive video here from our Mike Levine, who caught the Attorney General getting into his SUV on the way out of the Justice Department a little bit earlier after his crash course in the Mueller findings concluded 2 full days behind that desk pouring through those documents to write that letter. But you were saying,
right,
Lana,
and huddled with Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, and they made those conclusions. Democrats are going to want to know how they came to all of those decisions as the president is making his way back here to Washington, D.C. There's going to be a lot more, and we're already hearing from especially the people who want to be president and have the Democratic nomination in 2020. They're saying they want to know more. They want full disclosures. They want transparency. But again, I think they're going to start talking a little bit more about the things that are happening in the Southern District.
And John Santucci, speak of the devil.
Yeah, Lana, as if you knew we were going next, Lana.
I do think, but you make a very good point. Not just the Southern District, but there is a laundry list of Trump investigations, inquiries underway from various jurisdictions. I think we may have a graphic of that we can put up as we watch Air Force One taxiing for takeoff. But John, there's almost about a dozen investigations underway into all corners of Trump life that will become the new focus, new pain in his behind.
Certainly, and we're seeing some of them right now. I mean, that's, of course, Mueller's finished what's next for the process here. But really, as we're just watching that visual of Air Force One, the one thing that just came into my mind real quickly, if Donald Trump drank, he would be popping champagne right now on that plane, as he's probably watching nonstop cable news coverage as they taxi. But here's where we are on the next phase of the investigation. So the Southern District of New York is obviously the big one. They have 2 cases that they're working on right now. The first, campaign finance violations. That relates to the payments Michael Cohen made to silence Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal during the 2016 presidential campaign. The other investigations that have been ongoing relate to the president's inaugural committee. That is, of course, the team that put on the big event celebrating the president's swearing into office on January 20th, 2017. And then, of course, you have to think about what is happening outside of the federal jurisdiction, right, Devin? And, of course, this is where we get into the state cases. We have attorney generals competing for who's going to be first here. New York State Attorney General, New Jersey State Attorney General, Maryland, D.C., the list goes on. And just look at where they're looking into, Devin. The hotel, the emoluments. They're going into the Trump Foundation, self-dealing, the idea that we learned President Trump actually used money from his charity to pay for a painting of himself.
So if you're a Democrat frustrated with President Trump, want to see him taken down, those are the cases that you are focusing on.
Stand by and watch more of those. But the other thing we can't forget, too, is just the laundry list up on Capitol Hill. All of the committees that our team, Mary Bruce and others, are going to be watching. There is a competition right now happening, Lana, between who's really going to get there first. The House has a growing list, but also the Senate's still going.
Yeah, and I think that that we're going to be hearing increased calls for President Trump's tax returns. Remember, of the Trump associates who actually either were found guilty or entered guilty pleas, most of those were related to financial crimes. And with President Trump still not having released his tax returns, that's what Democrats are going to start asking.
And White House correspondent Tara Palmieri down in Florida has some new reporting. Tara, what are you hearing?
I just spoke to a source close to the president who I asked, why didn't the president attack Mueller in his first statement since the findings of the report came out, and why didn't he attack the press the way that his son Donald Trump Jr. did? And that person told me that, quote, it's time to move on. I think he gets it. So right now, according to this person who is close to the president, he now sees this as a moment to move forward and not to move backward in terms of attacking the press, attacking Mueller. And that person also noted, though, don't expect the president not to demand that there be some sort of investigation into how this all started. But still, at this point, President seeming to want to move forward instead of airing his grievances. We'll see how long that lasts.
We've heard that before, but we will see which direction he takes. He's got a busy week ahead on foreign policy here in this town. Tara Palmieri, White House correspondent, great to have your reporting. Thanks so much, Tara. And as we sort of wrap up our live coverage today, let's take a listen again to President Trump's first reaction, if you missed it a little while ago, as he takes off now on Air Force One, bound for Washington. He addressed reporters on the tarmac, and here's what he had to say.
So after a long look, after a long investigation, after so many people have been so badly hurt, after not looking at the other side, where a lot of bad things happened, a lot of horrible things happened, a lot of very bad things happened for our country. It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration. It's a shame that our country had to go through this. To be honest, it's a shame that your president has had to go through this before I even got elected. It began. And it began illegally. And hopefully somebody's going to look at the other side. This was an illegal takedown that failed. And hopefully somebody's going to be looking at the other side. So it's complete exoneration, no collusion, no obstruction. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. President,
Let's bring back our senior national correspondent, Terry Moran, for some closing thoughts. Terry, as we head into this new week in Washington, a new chapter of the Trump presidency, your thoughts on what's ahead?
Well, there's no question that President Trump fired the first shot right there in his next battle. When he says he hopes somebody investigates the other side, he's not talking about Robert Mueller. That's done. Mueller did his duty. He's talking about, as he has before, Barack Obama. He tweeted last year, quote, "I hereby demand and will do so officially tomorrow that the Department of Justice look into whether or not the FBI, DOJ infiltrated or surveilled the Trump campaign for political purposes, and if any such demands or requests were made by people within the Obama administration." There is a question for President Trump and his supporters in whether the previous president initiated a counterintelligence investigation into the political campaign of the other party was running against Obama's chosen successor. That's a question people want answered. It seems like it's one that President Trump wants to pursue, and one can almost hear him making it a campaign issue with chance of lock him up at his 2020 rallies, as there were chance of lock her up in 2016. There is much more of this kind of fighting to come.
Yeah, and certainly will be a talk point for him on the campaign trail, Terry, and I suspect that the Republican-controlled Senate will do just as you suggested, perhaps looking into the origins of this whole thing. Thanks so much, Terry Moran, our senior national correspondent, for that perspective and analysis. And guys, great to have you with us. Lana, Zach, John Santucci. John, you have been very plugged in with the Trump team through this whole thing. What's your thought on this going forward? Will the president continue to arm himself with this legal coterie around him as he faces the battles to come on Capitol Hill?
Yeah,
what's his posture now?
Well, it's a requirement, right? He needs the legal team around him to help him move forward because the battle's sort of only just begun. You know, Bob Mueller was the one and only, let's just say, enemy, if we're doing this in the art of war here, that they had for quite some time. Now, as we just went through, they have Democrats controlling Capitol Hill, all different committees that are going to go after the tax returns, like Lana mentioned. You have SDNY, the Southern District of New York, that's going into the personal business of the president. Remember, that's the red line he spoke about for quite some time. So yeah, the president is going to need the team he has and probably then some to deal with all of the battles ahead. So certainly he can paint this one as a win, but this is battle round one. There are several more ahead.
And Lana, Democrats going to have to tread very carefully on this one. We already heard Nancy Pelosi say President Trump is not worth the effort to impeach, but now they have this document. They had put so much weight on Robert Mueller.
And for them, this does not give them what they wanted. It hands the president victory. He is going to be talking about out on the campaign trail. I'm going to be really interested in what's happening in 2020. And I think there's a lot of investigation fatigue. After this has happened, and we know that there are other investigations that are ongoing that are going to continue, but I think people are going to really look for Democrats and Republicans to start getting something done and articulating themselves as having positions outside of just investigations.
And we shall watch that road ahead here on ABC News Live. Great to have you with us for this special coverage here on this Sunday here on ABC News Live. Again, Robert Mueller's report been analyzed by the Attorney General Bob Barr. Bill Barr, those findings have been summarized to Capitol Hill in a 4-page letter today, largely exonerating President Trump on the issue of collusion, an open question on the issue of obstruction of justice. Much more to come on Capitol Hill. John Santucci, Lana Zach, great to have you with us. Our coverage continues right now. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Thanks for watching.
This is an ABC News special report.